Welcome to episode 3, Pinnacle Fitness and Wellness's interview series with Charles Mobbs, PhD, Professor, Neuroscience at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Welcome.
Thank you.
Really looking forward to this interview.
Me too.
So let's just do a little brief background of your formal education and what leads you to this type of research.
Okay, so I went to high school in San Antonio at Keystone School, which is kind of like the Stuyvesant of San Antonio. So I was very fortunate to be able to do that. Went to MIT as an undergraduate. And then I went to the University of Southern California for my PhD, because at the time, it was really the only place to go for aging research. I had the Andrus Gerontology Center. And then I did my postdoctoral research at Rockefeller University, and then went on to Mount Sinai.
Okay, you found your way to New York.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Why don't you fill us in a little bit about your research at Mount Sinai?
Yeah, so to back up just a little bit, I knew that I wanted to be a biomedical researcher from the time I was like in 3rd grade.
Okay.
And that's when I discovered science, through science fiction, actually, originally.
Interesting, myself too.
Oh, yeah?
As well.
And but I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do for my research career until I was a junior at MIT. And I had to make some decisions, of course, at that point. And I'd been doing a lot of reading up until that point. And so the thing is, for me, I'm interested in sort of everything. It could be philosophy, mathematics, physics. So, and many aspects of biology are fascinating. So I couldn't really base my decision on what was most interesting to me, because everything is fascinating to me. So I instead decided, well, you only live once, so you might as well do the most important thing you can think of doing. And so that's when I decided, well, I was kind of on the cusp between studying the nature of consciousness or aging and age-related diseases. Because, let's face it, aging and age-related diseases are by far the main cause of death and morbidity. And so seems like that's a good thing to focus on. Nature of consciousness, I kind of decided, I just didn't think it was really that amenable to scientific investigation. Turns out that I was right about that, and so I think it was turned out to be a good call. However, at the time, and even now, the idea that there is a unitary process of aging that links all age-related diseases, kind of an unpopular idea, and I think a lot of people at the time, not so much now, but at the time, thought aging was kind of junk science, because people had a lot of sort of flaky theories, but nothing really solid. But you got to be in it to win it, and if you're going to make a contribution, you've got to be on the bleeding edge. And so that's what I did, and it turned out to be a pretty good choice for me. And we'll talk more about the details later.
Sure. So let's get into, me and you became friendly and through your wife, Sharon. Most people know me for fitness and massage therapy and so on. I actually work with your wife. I train her. And we had many conversations about weight loss. Mm-hmm. And you asked me what my thoughts were as far as how I felt training and weight loss. And I always was pretty strong that fitness is about being stronger, faster, and aging gracefully, so that we hold on to our coordination and some of these age-related things that we tend to lose as we get older. But when it came to weight loss, I always felt that diet was the most important, and your choices of foods and what they're made up of and so on. And that led us to, had some personal health problems, which led me to the ketogenic diet myself. And it just so happened that it was a big part of your research. So we have had many great conversations about it, and you enlightened me on many different little aspects of it that definitely heightened the experience of what being ketogenic meant. And you also educated me on some of the diseases that it's really helpful for. Some of them were epilepsy, some of the brain function stuff, obesity, type 2 diabetes. And your research and your laboratory at Mount Sinai actually focuses mainly on those topics. So, which is one of the reasons I was really looking forward to this interview. So, let's take that as a starting point to jump off and let us know about some of your research that you're doing over at Mount Sinai.
Yeah, so first of all, as you say, I completely agree with you about diet and exercise. Exercise is like the best way to age successfully. I mean, that's just clearly established, including what some people don't appreciate, mental function. It's actually
Sure.
the best way to maintain your mental functions. But I think it's equally clear, as you say, that for weight loss, it's all about diet. So, however, let's cut to the ketogenic diet business. So, kind of a long story short. So, I've been focusing on what drives aging since the beginning of my research career and how lifespan links to age-related diseases. So, I mentioned earlier that that was, and often still is, considered junk science. And in fact, Richard Dahl, a very famous cancer researcher, wrote an article called "There is no such thing as aging," by which he meant there is no unitary process driving the aging process. And he based that on some simple observations. So, for example, he's a cancer researcher. So we all know what causes cancer. It's accumulation of mutations that eventually inactivate genes that prevent cell division and activate genes that promote cell division. That's basically what it's about. And we all know that. And he says, first of all, that's just a matter of how many cell divisions you have and entropy. That, you're just going to get random mutations that will eventually happen that way. He said, what does that have to do with Alzheimer's disease? What does that have to do with Huntington's disease or Parkinson's? Nothing, he says, because those are post-mitotic tissues. They're not dividing. So he says every age-related disease has its own idiosyncratic cause. And so there is no such thing as aging. However, I have two arguments to counter that. And even he brought up one of those arguments. So one of the arguments he brought up that he says, well, yeah, but I can't explain this. And that's like this. We all know that different species have different lifespans. Clearly, that's genetically determined. And furthermore, so for example, dogs live only 1/7 as long as people, so that gave rise to the idea of dog years, right? So one dog year is worth 7 human years, basically. And yet, dogs get a lot of the same diseases we get, including cancer and arthritis and diabetes, but in dogs, they occur like at 10 years of age. Same exact diseases. They don't occur in humans till 70 years of age. What's up with that? Not only that, but mice only live basically 2 years, and they get a lot of the same diseases, but they get them at 18 months of age. This basically never happens in humans. Furthermore, and even better, we can actually engineer diseases that people get, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. For example, if you take the same gene that causes Huntington's disease or Alzheimer's disease, put that into C. elegans, transgenically express it, and C. elegans only live 14 days. They get pretty much the same disease at 10 days of age. So what's up with that? So that's kind of what I set out to try to understand. Obviously, and he admitted that he couldn't explain that, and I think that pretty well demolishes his hypothesis. There is such a thing as aging, and that's what I've set out to study. The other thing is, and this was discovered in the 1930s, that dietary restriction. So in that first series of studies, that was reducing the number of calories that the animals ate by 30%, substantially extends its lifespan, and essentially delays or eliminates essentially all age-related diseases, and that includes all forms of cancer, arthritis, and even the engineered diseases. So we've done that. We've engineered Alzheimer's disease and Huntington's disease, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, about the intermittent feeding. But we've shown that all of those natural and engineered diseases are delayed by dietary restriction. So, what's up with that? And that's basically what my research program has been about, because the idea there is not so much to extend lifespan. I mean, that's another question. But really, the idea is to eliminate age-related diseases, so you live a natural, happy, healthy life. I mean, you're going to die sometime, but hopefully not this horrible decline of function like Alzheimer's or cancer and the pain and the suffering. So we put that in a pill. That's the idea, and we've kind of gotten to that point, which I'll tell you more about.
Sure. So let's dive into that a little bit. So we talk about some of the traditional treatments versus some of these dietary interventions. Let's talk about some of those.
Well, as I said, definitely exercise is the best way we now know at the present time to maintain healthy aging. So I guess you'd call that a little bit traditional. There are a lot of other things that people do, like traditional, let's say, dietary or herbal interventions, and those are really not evidence-based. So, I'm a scientist, so if you can't prove it, I'm not going to go with it. We've shown, not me per se, but in my field, we've shown exercise is the best. At the moment, the only thing that I think we'll all agree on is a successful intervention is dietary restriction. And I want to point out that I'm using the term dietary restriction kind of very carefully, because in the literature and in the, I would say in the lay public as well, people often use the word caloric restriction, because originally it was caloric restriction, but as we'll talk about when we talk about the intermittent feeding, you can get the same protective effects of caloric restriction without actually restricting calories. And so it's not the calories. We know it's not the calories. And I can tell you more about that a little bit later.
It's not like calories in, calories out.
Two points I want to make about that.
Yes.
And so let me, if I may, just expand a little bit on how I got into, because my research program is not really just about aging, as you mentioned. It's about obesity and diabetes as well, and also age-related diseases like Alzheimer's and Huntington's. But the way I got into obesity wasn't that I set out to study obesity, but I realized that there's only one part of the body that really regulates energy balance, and that's a very small set of neurons in the hypothalamus that are specifically adapted to sense nutritional state. There's really no other part of the body other than pancreatic beta cells that can do that. And I don't think we need to get into the details, but I discovered how they do that. And but the reason that I focus on those neurons is that it was known from 1900 from human studies where people got tumors in the hypothalamus, and then they got obese and also lost reproductive function. So I thought that was the most logical place to look, and it turns out that was a really good guess. We can talk about the details about that later. But that's how initially, I didn't really have a good handle on how to understand what those neurons were doing to regulate the aging process. So initially, a lot of our work had to do with obesity, because I thought those were highly related, which turns out that they are. It's not so much that obesity is driving the aging process, but it's the same neurons that control obesity, and they also control glucose metabolism. And so that got me into diabetes, and that's actually what got me into the ketogenic diet. But I'll talk about that in a
we'll get into the mechanism of why ketogenic diet is so helpful for
Right.
type 2 diabetes and obesity and so on. So with the obesity, I also noticed some of your research, you also talk about leptin
Yes.
and some of its relationship to leptin with that population
Right.
as well.
Yeah.
So maybe we could bring some.
Yeah,
of that too.
so my colleague at Rockefeller University, when I was there, dis- discovered leptin, and basically that was based on an old a long-standing set of studies that there were forms of genetic obesity that had been discovered in mice, and so he was the one who first discovered what the basis of that genetic obesity was, and it turns out that those mice, there were two kinds of mice, and called OB and DB, and it turns out the OB mice were not able to make leptin, this hormone that's secreted by fat cells, and then the DB mice were not able to make a functional form of the leptin receptor. And it turns out that that receptor is expressed in the hypothalamus, and leptin itself is secreted from only from white adipose cells, basically. And so the purpose of leptin physiologically is to tell the hypothalamus, and it turns out to be exactly the same neurons that we've been studying, how much fat you have. So if you don't have leptin, or if you don't have leptin receptor,
Sure.
your hypothalamus thinks you don't have any fat. So it goes nuts.
Right.
And it makes you hungry, reduces your metabolic rate, makes you diabetic, and so that's how leptin works. Now, thing is, in humans, the more obese you are, the more leptin you have, because the more fat you have, right?
Sure.
And so, I mean, when this was Jeff Friedman, my colleague at Rockefeller, who discovered this, and when it was first isolated and cloned, everybody was hoping it was going to be like insulin. So
Sure.
all you have to do is give obese people leptin, and that will resolve the obesity. That would have been super outstanding. Unfortunately, it didn't work out because there are a few people in the world, like maybe 100, for whom that is true, because they have a mutation in the leptin in leptin itself. But worldwide, 100 people.
Right.
So, we have hundreds of millions of obese people, and in those people, leptin levels are actually very high because they have more adipose tissue. And in those people, by the way, you can give them all the leptin you want, doesn't change anything. So, bummer. I mean, would have been great, but it didn't work out. And so the kind of the way I think the field looks at that is it's kind of like type 2 diabetes, that, well, they're resistant to leptin, and so same thing in type 2 diabetes. The idea is they're resistant to insulin, so insulin levels rise. So type 2 diabetics generally have very high levels of insulin compared to type 1 who don't have any, and if you don't give them insulin, they die. So it's really not that different from the vast majority of diabetics. And eventually diabetic patients, almost by definition, their beta cells do conk out because they're just being overworked because they're secreting too much insulin. And then at that very late stage in type 2 diabetes, insulin does help. However, in obesity, no. Leptin just does not work.
So is it fair to say that, say we have an obese person, or we'll say type 2 diabetes, and doing a ketogenic diet, the pancreas now gets a break from having to deal with all this excess insulin that has to be secreted. It almost gives it time to recover so that it could start to deal with the high blood sugar levels. Is that a right way to look at it?
That is a fair statement, but since you raised the subject of ketogenic diet, let me explain a little bit about how we got into that. So one of my major contributions early in my career was to discover how do these hypothalamic neurons sense levels of blood glucose, because at the time, this is before leptin was discovered, that was the main way that we knew that these neurons sense nutritional state. And so we discovered that, and we have continued to. And it's very similar to the way pancreatic beta cells sense glucose. I'll just kind of leave it at that. But in the course of those studies later we continued to study that mechanism, and it wasn't exactly the same as pancreatic beta cells, at least the way pancreatic beta cells are usually talked about, the way most people think about how they sense glucose. And the, you know, it, to a lot of people, this would be kind of like a small detail. We all agree that it's glucose metabolism that is the signal. But this is what you learn in medical school and biochemistry textbooks, is the way this works in pancreatic beta cells is glucose is metabolized to make ATP, which is true, and the ATP blocks this particular ion channel called the KATP channel, and that depolarizes the cell, and that causes insulin secretion. Okay, so what we found, though, in the hypothalamus is it wasn't really ATP, was not the signal. It was, in fact, NADH. And I won't get into details, but I'm happy to send people our papers that support that. But to verify that in later years, we asked the following question. So we knew neurons can use ketones to make ATP. In fact, that's the preferred source of ATP if there's not enough glucose, like during fasting, for example.
Sure.
So since that was the case, if ATP, and we were basically fighting an uphill battle. Nobody wanted to believe what we had discovered, because, I mean, it's cool. Everybody agreed. It was cool that we showed that it was basically the same thing as pancreatic beta cells, but there was this kind of weird difference. And so to prove the point, we asked the question, well, if we give them ketones, specifically 3-hydroxybutyrate, which is the main ketone during fasting, if ATP is the signal, ketones should mimic the effects of glucose. But if NADH is the signal, as we thought, ketones should block the effects of glucose. And that's what we showed. It was really one of the coolest experiments I've ever done, because it was absolutely definitive. So, and that really made sense to me. That was one reason I was kind of like fanatic on the point, because you really don't want ketones to mimic the effect of glucose, because the only time you normally see ketones is when you're fasting. And you don't want to tell the hypothalamus, oh, I got plenty of nutritional resources now. No, the hypothalamus needs to know that you're fasting so it can respond appropriately. And therefore it didn't make sense that ATP would be the signal. So anyway, so we showed that ketones block the effects of glucose, and that was really cool and proved the point that it's not ATP. This is a little technical, I know, but bear with me. But then that led me to, so in the other side of my research lab, we were trying to understand the aging process, and long story short, we had concluded, actually I'd concluded very early in my research career, that it actually was glucose metabolism that's driving the aging process. So then I thought, if that's true, then the ketogenic diet should be, and also, of course, dietary restriction is always associated with production of ketones. Sure. So that fits really well, too. And actually, in the field of diabetes, like 90% of the field agrees that it's glucose metabolism that's driving diabetic complications. So I thought, well, in that case, the ketogenic diet, which, as you say, that's actually used in humans to treat epilepsy. That's its main.
Sure.
It's only clinically approved use right now, but it's very effective in treating epilepsy, almost certainly by blocking glucose metabolism in neurons and reducing the excitability of the neurons. But anyway, so I said, well, then it should, and I won't go into details, but because of other studies I had done, I thought it was not only possible to delay age-related and diabetic-related complications, but actually reverse them. And I mean, we could talk about that, but it's a little technical why I thought that. But I was the only person in the world probably who thought that at the time. So I had a medical student, Jody Fox. And Jody, if you're out there, hello.
Hello, Jody.
The reason I say that is because, well, it's a long story. Anyway, she was a medical student, and I said, so let's try this. Let's put diabetic mice on the ketogenic diet and see if we can prevent or even reverse diabetic complications. Well, Jody was a good medical student, and so she said, are you out of your mind? Because, as you probably know, what diabetic patients die, type 1 diabetic patients especially, what they actually die of if they don't get insulin is ketoacidosis. Yeah. And so she thought it was going to kill the mice, because sort of the last thing you want to do is accelerate that process. And long story short, I had reasons to think otherwise, and she was a good sport. And so she started the mice, these diabetic mice, on the ketogenic diet. Kind of thought they were going to be dead the next day, but they weren't dead the next day. As a matter of fact, she kept monitoring. She was really good. She monitored them every day. And it turns out that the control diabetic mice did start dying after a few weeks, but all the mice on the ketogenic diet stayed alive. In fact, we had to sacrifice the diabetic mice for humanitarian reasons, and because they were all dying. And but the ketogenic mice, we basically could keep them on that diet indefinitely, and they never died. And so that led to subsequent studies by some of my other students, particularly Jason Mestitis and Michael Poplawski, who then we went on to the even more ambitious study, wait until their kidneys are failing. And the reason, even though I'm a neuroscientist, the reason we studied kidney failure is it's really easy to measure, because you just measure the albumin to creatinine ratio in their urine, and that's really easy to do. So that's what we did. And so we waited until their kidneys were almost completely failing, and then we put them on the ketogenic diet. And their kidney function was completely normalized. And we showed that at the level of albumin to creatinine ratio, that's the functional level, but also gene expression. All the toxic genes that were induced by diabetes, they were all reversed. So, I mean, that was really just so dramatic. And we also showed, by the way, that the pH is, the blood becomes more acidic in type 1 diabetes because of ketoacidosis, but actually, that was true in the diabetic mice, of course, but that was actually completely reversed by the ketogenic diet. So I mean, not too surprising, but you know, we had to show it. So, I mean, we don't really fully understand why the ketogenic diet does not cause ketoacidosis, but it doesn't. It actually reverses ketoacidosis. So it's a difference, but I won't get into it. We don't really know exactly, but it doesn't matter. Point is, it completely reverses it. And that fit beautifully with the work we've been doing on dietary restriction. So
it really does. I mean, it's like the perfect love for
it really is. It's like a gift from the gods of science, I often say. So anyway, so that's how we got into the ketogenic diet.
Very interesting.
Oh, so all right. One other thing. Actually, we had already been studying the ketogenic diet for a different reason, which is that, and that's why we were ready to go with it when I thought of this idea, and that's because of the Atkins diet. So the Atkins diet, Atkins was very famous in the 80s and 90s, big deal. And I read Atkins' book, and sorry.
I did as well. We all did.
And
I had my issues with it.
I'll just have to say the science is pretty dodgy. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, it's time period, though, too. You know,
it's fine. I get that.
Talking
That's
like
fine.
27 years
But
ago.
low carbohydrate diets have actually been kind of a fad for like 100 years. So,
sure.
You know, so I knew, though, from my experience with mice, that a diet like the Atkins diet would actually cause obesity in mice, not reverse it.
Is that because it's too high in protein? I mean, Atkins had a lot of protein. Ketogenic is, I think we spoke once, about 7 to 8% protein overall.
That's basically correct.
Okay.
So basically the deal is like this. But this is not something that was appreciated in the field. Even I didn't really appreciate it until we started. So actually, I started studying the Atkins diet kind of to debunk it, basically. And indeed, when we formulated a diet that was identical to the Atkins diet, the mice did get obese on that diet. And so, you know, done. There was a high school student who did that project over the summer.
Right.
But there were a few things that puzzled me about that. I mean, that's what I expected. But what I didn't expect, because it is low in carbohydrates, certainly.
It is very
low.
So
I would have thought glucose levels would have been reduced, but they weren't. Glucose levels were not reduced. In fact, they were elevated. and insulin levels were elevated. And so I thought, what is up with that? We actually formulated a diet that had essentially no carbohydrates, but glucose levels were still elevated because it's mostly fat, but protein. And so then I kind of realized, well, actually, the true ketogenic diet, which is used to treat epilepsy, well, it has more protein than we really need, because for adults, the FDA recommendation is like 8% protein, 7 to 8%, and but we all eat a lot more protein than that because we eat meat and things like that. So we then used an actual ketogenic diet, which is 7% protein, 5% carbohydrate. I mean, that means 88% fat. Really high fat.
Well, you have to think about the fats too, and what the quality of the fats are as well.
Well, maybe. I'm probably not, but
right.
I mean, but right. Anyway, so I mean, because the diet we use is actually, the fat was lard, which is like not what you really want to do. I mean, I will agree with you that for certain health reasons we do have to consider the kind of fat, but not about energy balance. It doesn't matter what kind of fat it is. It just matters how much fat. Anyway, but then we showed, I mean, I was pretty astonished myself, but we showed that we have all kinds of models of obesity in my lab, and the ketogenic diet reversed obesity in all of them. It was just really crazy. I did not expect that. But I expect, well, I didn't know, I can't say what I expected, but anyway, completely reversed obesity, completely reversed diabetes, and as I say, that eventually led to our study where we completely reversed diabetic complications. But that was a very beautiful convergence of data with our aging studies, because ketones, 3-hydroxybutyrate in particular, are also induced by dietary restriction. So I'll turn it back over to you now, but at some point we'll talk about mechanism.
Right. Well, see, some of the when people talk to me about the ketogenic diet, and they talk about diabetes, and they like, if I get hungry at night, I'll just go and I'll just take Kerrygold butter. I'll just eat a whole bit. I eat it like ice cream, basically. And my wife will be like, "Are you crazy? You're eating butter. Your cholesterol is going to be off the chart." And I'm like, it's not, and I'm the leanest I've ever been, and she sees me putting ghee in my coffee, and brain octane, which is an MCT, caprylic acid, and I'm not really hungry for the whole day, and so there's a lot of misconceptions. Now, when we talk about type 2 diabetes, when we talk about traditional, we have people doing metformin and other pharmaceutical, and listen, it's been helpful for a lot of people.
Definitely.
I'm not going to down it. It has helped people. What I've always found with the ketogenic diet is, for people to be disciplined enough to actually do it properly, you have to put a lot of thought into it. Usually people who are type 2 diabetics are people who don't put any thought into their health, and that's why they have type 2 diabetes.
Well, I don't want to blame the victim here,
okay.
but
Fair enough.
Your point is well taken, and I'm glad you brought the business up about cholesterol, because I forgot to mention that. Because so doctors are horrified by the ketogenic diet.
They are totally horrified.
And that's why, I mean, much to my great annoyance, I have not been able to get a clinical trial going for this, but I think it would work. I'm certain it would work in people. On the subject of cholesterol, we showed that the ketogenic diet actually reduces cholesterol. And, I mean, not surprising. It's a kind of a long story, but I mean, if it's reducing body fat, it's going to reduce cholesterol, to make a long story short. And it does. So that fear is unfounded, let's say.
There is a little bit of a myth that, like, for example, I do the ketogenic diet, right? I have the coffee. I use, like, the brain octane. I put the ghee in there. And then, later in the day, I'll have some macadamias or some avocados. I have olive oil, but most of those things that I'm ingesting are mostly high in omega-3s, which are the anti-inflammatory of the oils.
Absolutely.
Most people are when they're ingesting some oils, usually omega-6, which is more inflammatory, and some of those things might be some of the reasons why their cholesterol might be going higher. Or is that safe to say that? That's why I say the quality of the foods. Like, I try to eat things that are more I guess maybe a little bit more of safer choices when I'm choosing ketogenic foods. I'm not choosing bacon fat, and I'm not choosing pork fats.
Yeah,
and stuff
I
like
mean,
that
is absolutely safe to say, but I just want to be clear on the point that you are right about the quality of fat and its health implications, particularly for cardiovascular disease, which of course is the number one cause of death. I agree with you. I'm convinced that that does matter. But for energy balance, and I have to say, we haven't been able to do the study I wanted to for lifespan, although in mice, but we have in C. elegans, and that's our model nematode that only lives 2 weeks. And 3-hydroxybutyrate certainly increases lifespan, period. And we've shown in, as I mentioned, many ways it increases health. But I agree with you that but C. elegans don't have a cardiovascular system, so but I think what you're doing is exactly the right thing to be doing, which is to be careful about the nature of the fats that you're eating because of the cardiovascular implications, which I think is fairly well established. It's kind of really epidemiological studies, and you never know quite what to make of those. But there's enough evidence that I think, sure, as long as you're going with a high-fat diet, choose the right fats. And
I try also not to heat oils and stuff like that because it oxidizes them.
Yeah,
and sometimes probably not the greatest thing for
that's
certain
a thing.
oils.
That's a thing, and I won't tell. I don't know. I'm not going to weigh in on that thing, but
that's
like I said,
I
mean, the ketogenic diet that we used was lard.
I know.
So it's like the worst thing. But yeah, I mean, honestly,
so to say, well, maybe not though, because people told me eating butter was also really bad for me. Now I'm eating butter and I'm eating.
This is a very famous factoid, by the way, as I'm sure you know, is that when we were growing up, it was like, oh, you can't eat butter, you have to eat margarine. Turns out...
Or coconut oil, for another. In the 80s, I grew up in the 80s,
right.
and, coconut oil was indemnified.
Exactly, and it turns out that's exactly bad advice. Butter is actually better than margarine, and coconut oil, I don't know. I'm going to go with it as like, I mean, I haven't used it myself, but I think there's a lot of good evidence that it's protective.
Yeah, probably not so bad. Whereas, like, when we spoke about the Atkins... The fats in some of that.
Absolutely.
I did the Atkins for
steak and bacon, and
I was eating them going. Listen, I know it's putting me in ketosis, and I have to be. I was much younger then, obviously. I'm almost 50 now. We're talking like 30 years ago. So, I think if I ate those foods now, I don't know how I would necessarily feel if I did like a strict Atkins. Although Atkins had a lot of protein, and proteins get broken down into glucose to use energy, whereas you're doing ketogenic, like you said, the protein's low, so
I
using ketones.
I actually, one of the things that's fun about my research is that you can experiment on yourself a lot, and I do that. And so I went on the Atkins diet, and indeed I lost weight. But the reason I lost weight is it basically reduced my food choices. So, when I went to a restaurant, I wouldn't eat bread.
Right.
So,
that's just bread, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a natural way of restricting caloric intake. But that's another thing I again want to emphasize because you brought this up. A calorie is actually not a calorie. So that is a complete. Well, I'm going to get probably a lot of hate mail from my colleagues about this, but it's true. It's clearly true that calorie is kind of like a convenient placeholder, and in the very kind of large perspective, it's more or less true, but there are ways to arrange calories, and ketogenic diet is one of them, where those calories are different from calories from sugar. They're just different, and they're more healthy. So, and we showed that. For example, for the ketogenic diet, we showed. So, one thing people might have thought is that, well, gross, 88% fat. Nobody wants to eat that. Well, actually, mice prefer the ketogenic diet to their normal chow. Now, their normal chow is very healthy. It's been over 100 years of research has optimized the chow diet, and it's what the American Heart Association says we should eat, which is like 70% complex carbohydrates. But I always do this self-experiment. So I've tasted mouse chow, and is kind of horrible. It's the same pretty much as the kibble that we feed our dog, and he doesn't like that either.
Right.
He'll only eat it because he has to.
Right.
So the ketogenic. So we gave mice the choice between chow and the ketogenic diet, based on the possibility that gross ketogenic diet is. But they love the ketogenic diet. If you give them a choice, they will only eat ketogenic diet.
Right.
So it's not that they're eating less; they're actually eating the same number of calories. What we showed is that the reason they're losing weight is that they increase their metabolic rate. And I'm not going to go into detail. We don't fully understand exactly why that's happening. It's kind of a little bit of a surprise, to be honest, but it clearly is happening. So that's how the ketogenic diet works as far as weight loss. And the way it's working for diabetic complications is that it's blocking glucose metabolism, which is what drives diabetic complications. Why it reverses complications is a little bit too technical to go into right now.
Would it be, to simplify it, would it be similar to what I said earlier about the pancreas not having to work so hard? You're kind of giving it a little vacation time so it can kind of recover.
I think that's,
and then maybe it starts to heal itself.
Yeah.
Listen, if it's so damaged, it's damaged,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
If you have
No,
damage,
I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. I mean,
for my audiences, they're not very super scientific, but I look at it as, how damaged is it? How damaged are you in a type 2 diabetic?
For any of your audience, I assume you'll put my email address, and for anybody who wants more details about how this is working, I can send them. I mean, we pretty much know how it's working. So I'm happy to send them some reviews that I've written.
Sure. I'm sure most of our viewers will probably go to Mount Sinai and probably start looking at some of the research. How do you feel about intermittent fasting? Because I know I've been doing that myself, and I have a couple of people that I train and so on that so I stop eating around 7:30 at night. I don't eat anything till the morning. The morning comes around. I don't really eat till about 12 o'clock in the afternoon, but I do the bulletproof coffee thing. I do the ghee, tablespoon of ghee, and I do 3 tablespoons of MCT oil, the brain octane. With the coffee, I shake it up in a thermos, I sip it through the morning. I am absolutely not hungry whatsoever.
Right.
If I get a little hungry during that time, you see me, I eat a couple of macadamia nuts. Right. If I'm really hungry, I'll eat a soft-boiled egg. But then later in the day, introduce my carbohydrates with salads and so on. I find that the intermittent fast has taken away all the sugar cravings 100%. I could look at ice cream and sugar now. It doesn't call out to me at all.
That is interesting, but so let me address that in a couple of ways. So I mentioned earlier that I use the term dietary restriction instead of caloric restriction precisely for this reason, because we and other people have shown that if you feed mice every other day, they will compensate on the day and so that means you take their food away on one day, but then they can eat as much as they want on the next day, and they'll eat twice as much. Because mice are really good at monitoring their caloric intake. But yet, even though that's true, intermittent fasting is just as protective as caloric restriction. And we, for example, showed this in a model of Huntington's disease. But many other people have shown the same thing. So absolutely. And I'm not quite sure about this, but I'm pretty sure that intermittent fasting is easier to maintain than actual caloric restriction. I mean, we know that caloric restriction, i.e. dieting, does not work. People just can't stand. People can go on a diet that means caloric restriction for like 6 months. Of course, they lose weight, but 95% of them can't stay on that diet, and they gain all the weight back, if not more, within 2 years.
Yeah, I
so
agree
this
with
is
that.
A famous fact.
I've been seeing that throughout my whole career as a trainer.
Exactly.
And so on.
But I mean, I think you're a good example of how effective intermittent fasting can be, and I am too, probably. And I would also like to point out, this may appeal to some of your viewers, that, well, this is a historically established fact that many religious traditions entail intermittent fasting. For example, Buddhists Buddhist monks at least, basically cannot eat afternoon. Afternoon, no more eating. So they can only eat in the morning. And, well, they're doing pretty well.
Yeah, they're fasting throughout
yeah,
the whole
and of course,
yeah.
obviously, as you know, fasting is a major tradition in all religious traditions. So that's exactly, like I said, why but during that time of intermittent fasting, when you're fasting, your ketones are going through the roof.
Yes, they are.
And
yeah,
so,
that's true.
And that's basically one of the main take-homes of our ketogenic diet studies, is that you can actually, just that temporary exposure to ketones is enough to reverse the toxic effects of glucose metabolism the day before. And so that's, I think, how it's working. So, I haven't quite adapted to your lifestyle, but I'm a big fan of your lifestyle, because everything that you say makes sense to me.
My food shopping bills are like cut in half since I've been doing
That's
it.
interesting.
Also, as well too. Because,
That is interesting.
Well, because think about it, I'm not eating any breakfast. Really. What am I having?
Yeah.
Coffee with
Yeah.
with some ghee and some MCT. I'm not really eating till lunch, and then I'm not really that hungry. So I'm eating like some soft boiled eggs, and I'm eating like some macadamias, and then for dinner I'm having like a bunch of leafy greens and piece of chicken, steak, or fish, and
sounds
with
good
it,
to me.
But I'm not really that hungry.
That's perfect, and that's what Buddhist monks say as well, that they're really just not that hungry. So you sort of adapt to a certain kind of nutritional lifestyle.
Yeah, I'm actually saving money. I'm lean as I've ever wanted to be. The other thing is, people don't. My understanding is, if your blood sugar is high, it's like the fat is offline. You know what I mean?
That's correct.
So
absolutely.
I have
correct.
these people that want to come and train with me in the morning. Like, oh, I have to eat. I'm like, don't eat anything before you come.
Right.
If you want to lose weight when you're training, eat zero. Eat nothing.
That's right.
Until 7:30 night in the morning. You come work out with me. Your blood sugar is about the lowest it's going to be in the whole entire day. You come and train with me. Trust me, there'll be energy. It'll start using ketones as energy, and you'll start accessing the fat. But if you throw sugar in there first thing in the morning, it's not going to.
I have to tell you, man, I completely agree with that, but that would horrify any physician.
Oh, they.
But I listen.
Yes.
Look. We come at this as sort of from two perspectives. You have a very empirical, personal understanding of this, and I come at it from a basic researcher's point of view. But we come to the same conclusions.
Yes,
so,
very much.
Hypoglycemia is a concern, but really only for diabetic patients.
I know. I hear people say that. Oh, I'm going to be low blood sugar. I'm not going to be. I was like, yeah, but your body has another system.
Exactly
that it can use,
and that's a good thing, right? Because what it means is exactly what you said. That's how you're going to burn fat.
Yes, if you want to burn fat,
and your peripheral, like your muscle, especially during exercise, will burn fat, and your liver will convert the free fatty acids to ketones and feed your brain. So, So I guess I'll leave it at that. Don't do this if you're a type 1 diabetic, but that's something you have to be conscious of, and that's another thing I study a lot, is the mechanisms of responses to hypoglycemia. So,
Type 1's a different arena.
It is a different arena.
We can't
but I'd just like to say I know a lot about it, and I still think you're right about this.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure having you on episode 3. Love to have you again on as a guest in the future.
We can talk about the mechanism at that point, because we've got drugs, we've got the mechanism, but
I would like to talk about some of the other interventions and different choices that people have.
Right.
Because some of those other choices that we spoke about, like ketogenic diet, it could be great for type 2 diabetics. Their doctors will be horrified by it, like you said. Most MDs they don't understand the mechanism of it.
Most PhDs don't either. So,
Well, you're at the forefront of the research, so you're
Right.
on like the cutting edge of it.
That's right.
I would say, as far as fitness goes, I'm on the cutting edge of my peers.
I would say.
Because, we've all experienced and tried different things, and we share the things that we feel successful
Right.
with our clients. The
Right.
same way you share yours with your students that you
Yes,
teach. You
that's
say,
right.
these are the mechanisms, we're showing what works, and I know what works in my field.
Right.
I've seen many different things come. I've seen vegetarians,
Mm-hmm.
vegans. I've seen, paleo. I spoke
Yes.
quite a lot about. Part of my diet's paleo. I do feel it has too much protein in it, though. But there are elements of it that I really like.
Yeah.
The oat, wheat, bran, barley.
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't really eat those in my diet because they raise blood sugar, and I do feel that they aggravate certain allergies that I have.
Interesting.
I don't know if it's necessarily glyphosate or chemicals that are sprayed on, but I do know if I eliminate them from my diet and I just eat various of nuts, seeds, proteins, all the butter, ghees, and all those things, my body reacts really well. All my allergies are gone, and I would have to say, we talked about it for epilepsy, and I read an article. I'm going to bring this in. That the article said they compared tinnitus, which I suffer from,
right.
as auditory epilepsy.
Yeah.
Because it was like a neural overfiring in the brain and so on.
Absolutely.
And the article was kind of interesting. I can't remember where I read the article, and I had asked you what your thoughts were, and you were like, you hadn't really heard of it, but in some way you could have made a little sense because
Sure.
sort of ketogenic diet, hands down, was very helpful.
Wow.
For the tinnitus.
That's
Did it make
awesome.
it go away? No, but did it make it manageable? I think it definitely made it manageable in a lot of ways. I have nerve damage from noise exposure. There's damage there.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily need to constantly overfire into something that's already damaged.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like the type 2 diabetic. They have damage in their pancreas, right? They can't make the insulin, but you have to think about, well, if you have damage, how are you going to lessen the damage, right? For them, it's not having abundant amounts of sugar.
I can't let this pass because we've also shown that the ketogenic diet reverses diabetic neuropathy as well.
See, that's huge.
Yeah, and also
That's
we have a
huge.
model of breast cancer, and it completely prevents metastasis in this model of breast cancer. And that's not too surprising. It's dietary restriction does the same thing.
Sure.
So, I mean, it's not surprising to me, but I think a lot of people are still on the fence about
So you're
that.
saying, would you say it's neuroprotective in a lot of
Absolutely neuroprotective. Absolutely.
ways? Neurogenesis?
Let's not go there.
That's a hard one to say because that's cutting edge right now.
Yeah,
People
yeah.
saying, well, what is and what is not?
Yeah. I mean, that's a completely different subject, and that I probably should be for another day.
That's another day.
I'm just going to say, neurogenesis in adults, there's a very, very low level of neurogenesis.
Sure.
So, doesn't mean it doesn't have any, impact. A lot of people think it does, but it's just at very low levels.
Right.
I mean, of course, we have not looked at neurogenesis, but I'm almost certain that the reversal of the neuropathy is not due to neurogenesis.
Okay.
It's kind of the same thing as happening in the kid. Well, how can I say that? Well, let's just leave it at that. But because I haven't even talked about mechanism. We've got the
gonna
whole
get into
mechanism
that.
going, but hopefully some other time.
Well, Charles, pleasure having you. Thank you so much for
My
coming.
pleasure.
And I look forward to speaking to you in part 2.
Absolutely.
Viewers, thank you. Be well.